In the waning years of the 20th century, a series of sealed intelligence archives began quietly surfacing across Europe. Fragments of forgotten missions, erased identities, and vanished technology buried beneath half a century of Cold War silence. Each document bore the same stamped insignia: Abteilung Geheim, restricted, Allied command copy. What began as routine declassification quickly unraveled into something far darker, hinting that the Second World War had never truly ended. It had simply gone underground. From sunken convoys beneath the Baltic to missing scientists hidden behind paper shields, these are the recovered fragments of history the world was never meant to see. Chapter 1: The Ghost Convoy of the Baltic Sea. By late January 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing on all fronts. Soviet forces under Marshal Rokossovsky had encircled East Prussia, driving German refugees toward the Baltic coast. Amid the chaos, the Kriegsmarine initiated several massive evacuation efforts, the most famous being Operation Hannibal. But buried beneath those official records exists another name, one absent from war logs yet whispered in intercepted transmissions: Convoy Eisenfaust. Unlike the refugee flotillas, Eisenfaust's mission was not to rescue civilians. Its purpose, according to fragments recovered from Soviet naval archives, was extraction of personnel and materials deemed strategically irreplaceable. The convoy allegedly departed from Königsberg in the early hours of March 6, 1945, under cover of a blizzard. Its flagship, the Sturmvogel, was a converted freighter reportedly carrying sealed containers marked Reichsforschung A9. Witness accounts collected from surviving dockworkers decades later describe a convoy of 4 vessels escorted by 2 minesweepers, all operating under false registry. Radio silence was ordered upon departure, and all logs from Pillau Naval Command for that night were later destroyed in a fire of unknown origin. Soviet coastal radar near Memel tracked a formation matching Eisenfaust's configuration for approximately 8 hours before contact ceased abruptly in the Gulf of Gdansk. For years, the disappearance was written off as another casualty of the Baltic evacuation effort. Thousands of ships were sunk during those final weeks of the war, many with no surviving records. Yet, in 1958, a NATO sonar team conducting deep-sea acoustic mapping detected a cluster of metallic anomalies on the seafloor, roughly 60 nautical miles north of Gdynia. The dimensions corresponded to 4 medium-tonnage vessels arranged in a formation inconsistent with known wrecks. When British divers descended, they encountered heavy silt and twisted hulls bearing traces of detonation from inside, not external torpedo damage. Among the debris, divers recovered a corroded metal cylinder stamped with the Reichsadler insignia and a partially legible code, Seelimb. The fragment was quietly handed over to Allied Command Intelligence, then transferred to US custody. A classified memorandum dated April 2, 1959, from the Office of Naval Research refers to materials of psychological warfare interest, of German origin, retrieved Baltic sector. No further documentation has ever been released. Declassified Soviet naval intelligence reports shed a darker light. A file marked Operation Silbermeer references a counter-mission launched from Liepāja to intercept an enemy convoy carrying advanced weapons prototypes and personnel linked to Abteilung Forschung. WWII. The order was issued by Rear Admiral Sergei Igorov under direction from NKVD Special Department 4. His post-action report, recovered after the fall of the USSR, records that contact with the intercept squadron was lost at 03:12 hours. Search efforts 2 days later found no debris, only an oil slick and fragments of lifeboats scorched from within. In the 1970s, independent researcher Dr. Heinrich Tauber of Hamburg obtained copies of German naval manifests captured by Soviet forces in 1945. Among them appeared a requisition order for Device Set S4, psychological field instrumentation, signed by SS Brigadeführer Karl Kleist, a scientist previously attached to the Ahnenerbe's Experimental Communications Division. Kleist disappeared from Berlin in February 1945. His name reappears briefly in a 1949 Argentine immigration ledger under the alias Karl Kruger, though no visual confirmation was ever established. What connects Kleist to Convoy Eisenfaust remains speculative. Yet multiple intelligence cables mention his involvement in neurological influence research conducted at the Gotenhafen substation, an underground complex near today's Gdynia. In 1992, the Polish Maritime Museum received an anonymous donation, a waterproof journal encased in resin. Its pages, though degraded, described the journey of Convoy E. The handwriting matched naval officer Hans Rudiger, missing since 1945. The entries detail increasing electrical disturbances aboard ship, sudden malfunctions in magnetic compasses, and the crew reporting auditory hallucinations during the final night before disappearance. The last legible line reads, "Signal received from command. Proceed to Point Nachtmere and await transmission. Do not respond." There was no further entry. The NATO archive on the Baltic wrecks remains sealed under security classification Omega Black, accessible only by joint authorization of defense ministries. Yet leaks from the 1980s revealed one additional layer. The United States Navy conducted a covert salvage operation, Project Shorelight, in 1961. The operation's after-action report, declassified in fragments in 1998, states that 2 metallic canisters were recovered and flown directly to Andrews Air Force Base under diplomatic seal. All personnel involved were reassigned or discharged within months, several reportedly under psychiatric evaluation. Eyewitness accounts from Polish fishermen in later decades tell of lights beneath the water during the spring of 1962, visible for several minutes before fading. Local naval officials dismissed the phenomena as bioluminescent plankton. However, when commercial divers attempted exploration in 1974, they were met with immediate radio interference and abrupt power failures in their submersible systems. Equipment readings indicated high residual electromagnetic activity around the wreck zone, decades after the ships had sunk. Today, the coordinates remain off-limits under environmental and military protection orders. Yet the question lingers, why preserve secrecy over a handful of rusted wartime hulls? Some historians argue the convoy carried not weapons but data. Experimental transmissions or radio frequencies tied to the Reich's last-ditch psychological warfare research. Others believe the payload was more tangible, components of the rumoured Seelenwaffe, a mind interference apparatus first mentioned in intercepted SS communications from January 1945. If such a device existed, its testing would have required both scientific expertise and a mobile deployment platform, precisely what a concealed naval convoy could provide. The deeper story of Convoy, Eisenfaust, may never surface completely. What fragments remain are smothered beneath layers of official denial and half-erased testimonies. Still, the Baltic holds its memory well. Beneath cold grey waters, in the silt of forgotten wars, the hulls rest in silent formation, as if waiting for a signal that never came. And somewhere, in an unmarked archive in Washington or Moscow, the word Seelenjauts still glows faintly on aging paper, its meaning erased by time but not entirely lost. Chapter 2. Operation Paper Veil, the Disappeared Scientists. In the aftermath of Germany's surrender in May 1945, the Allies launched a secret initiative known as Operation Paperclip, a transfer of German scientists to the United States under covert clearance. It was a public secret, a morally grey necessity to gain advantage in the emerging Cold War. But behind Paperclip existed a shadow operation few in Washington or London ever knew by name: Operation Paper Veil. This secondary extraction, initiated in late 1946, involved a smaller, more selective group of 27 individuals marked not for recruitment, but containment. The first confirmed mention of Paper Veil appears in a decrypted OSS cable dated November 12, 1946. It refers to Asset Group Null, non-reportable subjects relocated under Authority of Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, Section Delta. No names were listed, but subsequent correspondence between US Army Air Forces and the Chemical Corps Research Command references individuals of advanced neurological expertise formerly attached to Oranienburg, Peenemünde, and Gotenhafen facilities. These locations had been central to both Germany's rocketry program and its more clandestine neuropsychological experiments, projects rumored to explore human susceptibility to suggestion through electromagnetic fields and nerve agents, while Paperclip scientists went on to become public figures in NASA, aerospace, and weapons development. The Paper Veil group disappeared into a vacuum of sealed files and erased identities. One captured Gestapo logistics manifest from 1945 names a Dr. Victor Hecht, physicist and specialist in radiation pulse control, as missing from Soviet detention. A decade later, a US Air Force requisition order lists a Victor H as a civilian consultant at Facility A9A, an installation in the Nevada desert labeled only atmospheric testing, psychological division. There are no employment records, payroll files, or medical entries, just a single security clearance signature. Approved under Vail authorization. In 1952, a classified CIA memorandum titled Project Whisper Cell references continuing studies from the German corpus regarding induced behavioral resonance. It contains several redacted paragraphs, followed by the line, Facility A9 reports successful Phase 2 test, Group Null personnel stable. 3 months later, all Whisper Cell documentation ceased. Declassified Atomic Energy Commission papers reveal that in late 1953, a restricted area west of Groom Lake was declared off-limits to all civilian flight for reasons of high electromagnetic activity. This coincided with the sudden termination of multiple paperclip contracts, particularly those linked to neurological and frequency-based research. The few surviving testimonies from scientists transferred. Under paperclip mention whispers of another contingent, colleagues who vanished en route or were rerouted mid-transport. Dr. Heinrich Leiss, a chemical engineer captured in Bavaria and interviewed in 1957, told a journalist before his death that he met men who were neither prisoners nor free, bound for somewhere called the 9 facility. His statements were dismissed as delusional, yet his phrasing matches terminology later uncovered in Project Blue Book documents referencing Sector 9, Nevada Test Complex. In 1973, a retired logistics officer from the US Army Quartermaster Corps, Captain Harold Baines, disclosed in a taped interview that he once handled classified supply manifests addressed to Facility A9 paper veil cargo. According to Baines, the shipments included refrigerated biological samples, vacuum-sealed microfilm, and a single lead-lined container labeled Oranienburg Retained Assets. He was instructed never to inventory the contents. 2 weeks later, the container and accompanying aircraft were rerouted mid-flight to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. The plane never appeared in Air Force transport records. Baines' account was archived by journalist Robert Thorne, who was later found dead in 1978, ruled an overdose, though the tapes he'd recorded were missing from his apartment. Documents released under the Freedom of Information Act in 1982 confirmed that at least one paper veil scientist, Hans Delmar, a neurobiologist, was officially recorded as deceased in 1945, yet continued to receive US military pension payments through 1968 under a different identity. His trail ends at a company front called Hydrex Corporation, later revealed to be a CIA-linked contractor specializing in non-lethal cognitive defense research. Hydrex ceased operations abruptly after a warehouse fire destroyed all physical records in Arlington, Virginia. No insurance claims were filed. By the early 1960s, Soviet counterintelligence had begun to take notice. KGB archives opened briefly in the 1990s reveal a dossier labeled Operation Maskirovka 22, Retrieval of Missing Assets. Soviet agents reportedly attempted to track paper veil scientists through academic publications, focusing on recurring patterns of experimental terminology, resonant frequency control, amplitude behavior induction, cognitive interference modeling. Their conclusion, these were remnants of pre-war research under Project Seelenfeld, a Nazi attempt to manipulate human cognition through synchronized electromagnetic waves. The Soviet report speculates that the Americans continued these experiments deep underground, using captured German knowledge as their foundation. In 1961, a US Air Force internal incident report documented a containment breach at Facility A9 following an experiment described as low-frequency field amplification. The event caused widespread communication blackouts across 3 counties in Nevada. Civilian authorities were informed it was a nuclear test. One surviving log entry reads, "All Group Null personnel accounted for except Subject 14. Subject displayed extreme physiological disorientation. Isolation recommended." After that, Facility A9 was officially dissolved. Its coordinates were absorbed into what would later become the Groom Lake Restricted Area. Eyewitnesses from the local town of Rachel, Nevada, described bright pulses in the sky during that same year, accompanied by a droning hum audible for several minutes. Livestock reportedly fled from fenced enclosures, and several residents later complained of recurring auditory phenomena described as voices in static. Within weeks, US Army survey teams arrived, confiscating civilian radio equipment and warning residents to stay indoors during aerospace testing. When the Senate Intelligence Committee reopened Cold War research investigations in 1977, Operation Paper Veil was briefly mentioned in a closed hearing. Senator Frank Church's notes, partially preserved, include the line, 27 foreign nationals, no disposition, Groom 4 terminal flight log classified. The same phrasing appears in a 1982 declassified Department of Defense memo. Transfer of Paper Veil assets complete. Groom 4 authorized disposal. The implication was never clarified. Whether disposal meant relocation, elimination, or absorption into other projects remains unknown. In the decades since, fragments of testimony and recovered documents suggest that some of the Paper Veil personnel were later seen embedded within early aerospace research programs, while others were linked to defense laboratories specializing in electronic warfare. Their true contributions, however, remain absent from history. The surviving files are riddled with deliberate inconsistencies, redactions, and falsified dates. Even their death certificates appear photocopied from unrelated cases. Yet one haunting artifact endures: a photograph recovered from a destroyed storage locker at Wright-Patterson in 1989, depicting a group of men in civilian clothes standing before a desert testing rig. Written on the back, in German cursive, are the words Gruppe Null, Die zweite Sonne, the second sun. Whether this referred to a code name, an experiment, or something more ominous remains unresolved. But as with the vanished convoy in the Baltic, Paper Veil left no graves, no memorials, and no closure. Only a trail of signatures and missing pages that vanish just as the truth comes into focus. Chapter 3: The Vatican Black Archive Files. In the years following the collapse of the Third Reich, the Vatican's vast network of diplomatic channels became a refuge for information, and, in some cases, for the men who carried it. In 1947, amid the Allied push to catalogue and confiscate Nazi intelligence materials, a sealed cache of SS documents was quietly transported from the ruins of Berlin to the Apostolic Palace in Rome. Its custodian, Bishop Alois Hudal, rector of the Pontificio Istituto Teutonico di Santa Maria dell'Anima, later exposed as a key architect of the so-called rat lines. Within Vatican corridors, this collection became known only by a whispered codename, Archivum Obscurum, the Black Archive. Officially, the Vatican has never acknowledged the archive's existence, yet traces appear in the correspondence of multiple intelligence agencies during the early Cold War. A British SIS dispatch from March 1951 references Vatican retention of psychological warfare documentation linked to SS Section 20, occult and morale studies. The attached notes warn of experiments inconsistent with scientific ethics, involving controlled sensory deprivation and symbolic exposure. The same phrasing appears again 3 years later, in a CIA memorandum regarding Nachtgeist, records believed to be part of the Black Archive's hidden collection. Nachtgeist, literally night spirit, was reportedly an SS operation designed to explore psychological conditioning through auditory and visual resonance, weaponizing fear and faith alike. Among the surviving testimonies from post-war German clerics, one in particular stands out. Father Joseph Koenig, a Benedictine monk from Regensburg, later debriefed by the US Counterintelligence Corps, described being tasked in May 1945 with cataloguing crates received from the ruins of the Reich Main Security Office. He recalled that several boxes contained film reels and illustrated manuals labeled Projekt Nachtgeist ab den Deusen Bavaria. Koenig said he was instructed to repackage the materials for shipment to Rome under diplomatic cover. The shipments traveled via the Red Cross courier line from Munich through Innsbruck to Vatican City, bypassing Allied inspection. Koenig's sworn statement was classified until 1976. Within the Vatican itself, references to the Black Archive appear sporadically in internal memoranda from the Secretariat of State. One 1948 circular, signed by Cardinal Giovanni Montini, later Pope Paul VI, ordered the secure cataloguing of politically sensitive German material under the custodianship of Archivum XIII. A marginal note in Montini's own handwriting reads, Nachtgeist, theological implications under review. It is the only known Vatican document to mention the codename directly. Independent researchers tracing post-war ratline operations have uncovered hints that Archivum Obscurum was far more than a historical collection. Between 1949 and 1953, several former SS officers, including intelligence analysts from the Ahnenerbe Institute, were documented as having received sanctuary in monasteries throughout northern Italy. Among them was Dr. Karl Kleist, the same name associated with Convoy Eisenfaust, though no official record places him in Rome. A customs ledger from Genoa dated June 17, 1948, lists K. Kleist, theologian, Vienna as passenger aboard a Vatican diplomatic vessel, bound for Buenos Aires. That manifest is one of several later sealed by the Holy See. What the Vatican gained from sheltering these individuals remains subject to speculation. Some historians argue the Church viewed the documents as moral evidence against totalitarianism. Others, more cynically, believe the material was seen as spiritual ammunition, a study of mass belief manipulation under the guise of scientific inquiry. One Italian intelligence report from 1963, declassified in 2009, describes an internal Vatican division known as Collegium Internum dos Sfer, allegedly formed to evaluate the metaphysical dimensions of propaganda. The report claims that portions of Nachtgeist research were reviewed by Jesuit scholars in a closed symposium at Castel Gandolfo in 1958. No minutes were ever released. The trail darkens in 1969, when Jesuit priest Father Ernesto Varani submitted a memorandum to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith requesting permission to access sealed German files of theological significance. The request was denied. Varani persisted, writing again the following year, noting that the materials concerned spiritual acoustic phenomena documented by Reich laboratories. 2 months later, Varani vanished during a train journey between Milan and Rome. His body was never recovered. Vatican officials declared him missing. The Jesuit order quietly reassigned his duties and sealed his correspondence. The first public reference to the Black Archive surfaced in 1981, when Argentine journalist Luis de Michelis claimed to have obtained a microfilm reel from a Vatican intermediary. The footage reportedly showed a dimly lit chamber, a lectern bearing SS insignia, and an unidentified man delivering a sermon in German to an empty hall. The film's audio contained a faint rhythmic hum beneath the voice, later analyzed as a modulated frequency tone. De Michelis alleged the recording was part of Operation Nachtgeist, designed to test subliminal influence through sermon broadcasts. Before he could publish the material, De Michelis was killed in a car crash near Mendoza. The microfilm disappeared. In 1991, a second reel, possibly from the same series, surfaced at a private auction in Buenos Aires. The auctioneer, unaware of its origin, described it simply as German propaganda footage. 1945. Bidders included known intelligence front representatives from both Western and Eastern agencies. The reel was sold anonymously for an undisclosed amount. Its buyer remains unknown. Interpol notes indicate the footage was shipped to Zurich under a false export license. From there, it vanishes entirely. To this day, the Vatican refuses comment on all inquiries regarding the Black Archive. Requests for archival access, submitted under the Apostolic Letter on transparency, have been denied on grounds of national and ecclesiastical security. Yet several scholars who have examined Vatican indexes note conspicuous gaps between 1945 and 1953 in the catalogue numbering system of section sorting, a department officially designated for non-canonical research and historical correspondence. Those missing catalogue numbers correspond precisely to the years the ratlines were most active. What little evidence remains is drawn from peripheral shadows, fragments of letters, smudged stamps, anonymous testimonies, and yet a pattern emerges. It points to a deliberate preservation, not destruction, of the Nachtgeist materials. Some within the Vatican hierarchy may have viewed the data not as heretical, but as proof of the psychological vulnerability of faith, a mirror too dangerous to destroy. The Black Archive may have become both reliquary and warning. In 2002, an Italian archivist working within the Vatican Library anonymously contacted historian Dr. Andrea Fabbri, claiming to have seen a sealed chest marked Archivum Obscurum, 1947, stored in the subterranean stacks beneath the Apostolic Palace. The chest reportedly bore the symbol of the double lightning bolt, the insignia of the SS. When Fabbri attempted to verify the claim, the contact disappeared. The archivist's Vatican identification number was later reassigned to another employee. No record of his resignation or death exists. If the Black Archive still exists, it lies deep beneath the marble floors of the Vatican, beyond public catalogues, guarded by silence and divine jurisdiction. Its contents, if ever revealed, may illuminate how far humanity ventured into the manipulation of the human soul under the guise of science and salvation. Or perhaps, as some within intelligence circles quietly suggest, it holds evidence that belief itself was the first battlefield of psychological warfare, one that began long before the Cold War and has never truly ended. Chapter 4: Cold Silence over Kolyma Station. The Kolyma region of northeastern Siberia remains one of the most desolate places on Earth, a landscape of permafrost, abandoned labor camps and forgotten graves. Yet buried within Soviet archives unsealed in the early 1990s lies mention of a facility that, for nearly 3 decades, existed only in rumor: Gulag 23-9, later reclassified as the Kolyma Radio Observatory. Officially, it was a meteorological outpost established in 1949. Unofficially, it became the epicenter of one of the strangest and most heavily redacted Soviet projects of the Cold War: Project Zov. The first trace of Zov appears in a Ministry of Internal Affairs directive dated April 12, 1950, authorizing the construction of an isolated research installation for the purpose of atmospheric and electromagnetic observation. The directive was signed by Lavrenti Beria himself, then head of the MVD, and included a clause for non-standard psychological evaluation procedures for assigned personnel. The attached annex referenced the use of trained operators from former communications, regiments, code for military signal intercept officers. Kolyma Station, as it became known, was erected atop an abandoned gold mining camp near the settlement of Oymyakon, where temperatures routinely dropped below 50 degrees C. Its location provided both natural isolation and, conveniently, plausible deniability. Soviet veterans' testimonies gathered decades later paint an eerie picture of life inside the compound. The facility, consisting of a central transmitter dome and 3 concentric antenna arrays, operated year-round despite the harsh climate. Civilian workers were rotated every 3 months, but scientific and intelligence personnel were stationed for years at a time. Access required triple authorization from the MVD, the Ministry of Defense, and an entity cryptically labeled Directorate V. No one outside this triad ever set foot within the dome. First Western reference to Kolyma Station appears in a 1956 CIA signals report documenting unidentified, low-frequency transmissions emanating from Siberian Sector N58. These transmissions, described as rhythmic pulses followed by extended silences, lasted precisely 66 seconds each cycle. Attempts to triangulate the source led analysts to an approximate grid coordinate corresponding with the Kolyma Basin. The US Air Force codenamed the pattern Echo Black. When analysts compared it to known Soviet radar systems, no match was found. One internal memo, declassified in 2003, summarized the finding bluntly: no clear purpose, no command structure, possible psychological deterrent. Then, in November 1956, the pulses abruptly ceased. For 7 weeks, the entire Kolyma region went radio silent. No weather reports, no troop communications, no civil transmissions. The Soviet Far East Command issued a statement citing equipment failure due to atmospheric disturbances. Yet American ELINT satellites recorded no solar flares or geomagnetic anomalies during that period. When transmissions resumed, they were markedly different. Longer bursts, erratic patterns, and an irregular background hum, as though the system itself were misfiring. The Soviet internal investigation began in January 1957, when an inspection team was dispatched from Magadan. Their preliminary report, recovered from KGB archives after the fall of the USSR, reads like something out of a ghost story. Upon arrival, the inspectors found the outer perimeter gates frozen open, guard posts unmanned. Inside the compound, food remained uneaten in the mess hall, lights were still on, and radio equipment hummed on standby. Not a single living person was found. The logs stopped abruptly at 03:14 hours on December 29, 1956. The final entry in the operations journal consisted of just 5 words: "We heard the sky answer back." All 34 personnel were declared missing, presumed dead due to exposure, yet no bodies were ever recovered. The KGB sealed the site, declaring it contaminated due to electrical discharge hazards. For the next decade, the area was omitted from all official maps. It was only in 1967, during a short-lived thaw in Soviet scientific openness, that Kolyma Station reappeared in internal communications. This time as a restricted listening post, managed by the Main Intelligence Directorate, GRU. Western intelligence, aware but uncertain, monitored renewed transmissions from the same coordinates. These bursts, however, carried a peculiar characteristic. They mimicked NATO radio frequencies, creating phantom signals across the Arctic listening network. The phenomenon became known within NORAD as Kolyma echoing. Declassified Soviet documents suggest Project Zov's true purpose was to experiment with extremely low frequency, ELF waves, believed to penetrate deep into both the Earth's crust and human neural tissue. The project sought to determine whether long-range communication could be achieved not just between machines, but between minds. Psychologist Major Leonid Zorin, assigned to the project in 1954, hypothesized that ALF modulation could induce collective cognitive harmonization, what Western researchers would later call mass psychogenic influence. Zorin vanished in 1957, his personnel file later stamped non-repatriable asset. By the mid-1970s, the US Navy's Project Sanguine and the Soviet Woodpecker system both began exploring ELF communications. Former GRU officer Sergei Voronov, defecting to Finland in 1982, told interrogators that, "The Americans think they invented this. They are 20 years late. We lost men to it. Minds broke." He claimed that after the 1956 incident, Kolyma Station was partially dismantled and converted into an underground repository. The surviving transmitters, he said, were sealed behind reinforced concrete, powered only once a year to listen if it still speaks. Supporting Voronov's claim, Canadian amateur radio enthusiast in 1984 reported intercepting rhythmic ELF bursts matching the pre-1956 Kolyma frequency pattern. The pulses were faint but unmistakable, and each transmission ended with a descending tone, identical to the archival recordings preserved by the CIA in 1955. When NATO analysts cross-referenced the pattern with current Russian radar signatures, the source could not be located. The signal appeared to originate from beneath the surface, somewhere near the old Kolyma coordinates. Modern satellite imaging reveals faint outlines of collapsed structures in the region, overgrown by tundra. Despite official denial, occasional expeditions have attempted to reach the site. In 2001, a private Russian exploration team reported finding remnants of concrete foundations and rusted transmission masts protruding from permafrost. Their Geiger counters registered elevated radiation levels, not enough to kill, but far beyond natural background levels. Two members of the team later claimed to have experienced severe tinnitus and persistent auditory hallucinations, resembling distant static voices. Their recordings were confiscated by Russian authorities upon return to Yakutsk. What remains of Kolyma Station today is uncertain. The Russian government maintains a restricted zone designation over the coordinates, citing environmental contamination from mining waste. Yet, every few years, reports surface from Arctic communications networks describing unexplained bursts of ELF interference, identical in duration to the original 66-second pulse. Some believe these are natural anomalies. Others suspect an automated transmitter still buried beneath the permafrost, operating on preset cycles since the 1950s. A machine built to listen, and perhaps to respond. The most chilling theory, however, comes from a single declassified Soviet memo dated March 1957, weeks after the disappearance. It references an internal discussion between Beria's successors regarding whether to reactivate the Resonance project under revised safety conditions. One note scrawled in the margin reads, "No human monitoring, it will listen alone." Whatever happened at Kolyma Station, it remains an unresolved fracture in Cold War history, an echo frozen in time, reverberating through the Arctic silence. The official story ends with the closure of the site and the presumed death of its personnel, but somewhere in the static, under the auroral hum of northern skies, the pulse still lingers. 66 seconds on, 66 seconds off, a mechanical heartbeat waiting for an answer that no one should ever give. Chapter 5: The Luxembourg Protocols. In the summer of 1946, as Europe rebuilt itself from the wreckage of the Second World War, a discreet meeting took place at the Hotel Cravat in Luxembourg City, Present were representatives of the Allied Control Council's Financial Intelligence Unit, members of the newly formed Bank for International Settlements, and a handful of men whose names had been erased from official records. Former industrial executives of IG Farben, Krupp, and Daimler-Benz. Their agenda was ostensibly reconstruction, but the minutes of that meeting, later referenced only as Protocol LX47-MARM, suggested otherwise. Behind the polite diplomacy of post-war recovery lay the framework of an economic shadow network designed to preserve and rechannel what remained of the Nazi industrial machine. The documents, discovered decades later among partially burned papers from the archives of Operation Safehaven, reveal the existence of a covert fund codenamed Eisenkasse, the Iron Treasury. Eisenkasse's purpose was twofold: to secure surviving Reich assets from Allied seizure and to finance clandestine operations, ensuring Germany's eventual resurgence under a new guise. Economic rather than military. Funds were transferred through neutral banks in Switzerland, the Vatican, and Liechtenstein, using shell companies established during the war to conceal the movement of gold and bearer bonds. One memorandum, dated October 12, 1946, signed by a man identified only as HG, details an agreement between the Bank of International Settlements and an unnamed Vatican account to temporarily hold extraordinary deposits pending. Normalization, a separate British Foreign Office cable, describes unaccounted flows of German capital through Luxembourg intermediaries, facilitated by post-war humanitarian trusts. The money trails led nowhere, and when questioned, the Vatican cited diplomatic immunity. It wasn't until 1951 that the CIA's Economic Warfare Division connected these transfers to an entity labeled the Luxembourg Protocols. According to internal CIA files declassified in 2004, the Luxembourg Protocols were not a single document, but a set of agreements, unregistered treaties between Western intelligence services, surviving German financiers, and selected industrialists. Their goal was the redirection of Nazi capital into anti-Soviet infrastructure, propaganda networks, intelligence fronts, and research programs in both Europe and South America. One section of the protocols, labeled Postbellum Technics, authorized cooperation with ex-Wehrmacht engineers to continue non-conventional development under private corporate sponsorship. This included research into propulsion, metallurgy, and biochemical defense, fields once overseen by the Reich Ministry of Armaments. A 1954 State Department memo references Eisenkasse directly, stating, "Subject funds utilized for containment measures and reconstruction under economic supervision of NATO." The memo's tone is clinical, but the attached ledger reveals disbursements to companies later exposed as CIA proprietaries, notably the Dietrich Corporation and Euralex, both linked to Cold War psychological and biological experiments. The funds also supported political activities, the establishment of anti-communist labor unions in Western Europe, and the covert financing of certain Christian democratic parties, ensuring a pro-Western alignment during the fragile Reconstruction years. One journalist who came dangerously close to uncovering the entire network was Marianne Klug, a financial correspondent for Der Spiegel. In 1977, she began investigating suspicious Luxembourg bank transactions involving a front company named Helvetic Trust AG. Her notes, recovered from her apartment after her death, outline a discovery. Helvetic Trust was managing the remnants of Eisenkasse under new ownership, a consortium registered in Brussels, controlled by individuals with ties to NATO logistics procurement. Klug's car exploded in April 1978 on the E25 motorway, a few kilometers outside Brussels. The explosion was attributed to a fuel leak. Her draft article, titled "The Fourth Reich's Bankers," disappeared from Der Spiegel's editorial archives the same week. 2 years later, in 1980, a warehouse fire engulfed the Luxembourg National Archives. Officially, the cause was faulty electrical wiring. Among the destroyed materials was a sealed file labeled LX47. A single surviving carbon copy, smuggled out by an archivist, found its way into the hands of Belgian historian Jules Vermeer. His 1986 book, The Iron Treasury, Post-War Reconstruction or Hidden Empire, was withdrawn from publication within weeks of release following legal threats. In interviews years later, Vermeer claimed he had only glimpsed part of the truth. He described seeing a document stamped with both the US Treasury seal and the emblem of the Gehlen organization, West Germany's pre-BND intelligence agency, composed largely of former SS and Wehrmacht officers. The dual marking, he said, proved that Eisenkasse had evolved from a Nazi survival fund into a Western intelligence financing mechanism. Further corroboration emerged after German reunification, when the BND inadvertently released financial correspondence, referencing Project Edelstein, a Cold War-era initiative to stabilize friendly, industrial assets through off-the-books liquidity injections. The recipient? A Luxembourg holding company with a name eerily familiar, Helvetic Trust AG. The documents show deposits continuing as late as 1974, long after most surviving wartime industries had been restructured. A handwritten note at the bottom of one page reads simply, "Per LX protocol, continued per NATO directive." It is believed that the Luxembourg protocols also facilitated the migration of wartime scientific research, not just personnel, as seen in Operation Paperclip, but entire archives. A 1952 US Air Force intelligence file labeled Asset Transfer, Düsseldorf, Luxembourg, lists 43 sealed crates of technical papers, metallurgical data, and prototype schematics. Their contents were never catalogued in open records. Researchers suspect they may have included materials connected to Germany's late war propulsion experiments, some of which later appeared in aerospace patents filed under US contractors throughout the 1960s. The Vatican's potential involvement remains one of the most closely guarded aspects of the protocols. In 1950, a letter from the Apostolic Nuncio to Washington references support for economic rehabilitation efforts through private financial cooperation channels. Attached to that letter, now preserved in the US National Archives, is a bank routing code leading directly to Luxembourg's Banque Générale. It is one of the few concrete links between Vatican accounts and post-war German capital movement, though church representatives have consistently denied any awareness of its wartime origin. By the late 1980s, most evidence of the protocols had vanished. Witnesses either retracted their statements or died under ambiguous circumstances. One declassified MI6 report from 1981 notes the convenient destruction of Archive Vault 12 in Luxembourg following the aforementioned fire. The report concludes with a line written in pencil. The fire was not electrical. Containment achieved. Even today, occasional references surface in financial leak investigations. Shell corporations bearing the same post-war structures, accounts dormant for decades, transactions routed through intermediary trusts echoing the Eisenkasse pattern. Economists have speculated that portions of Europe's post-war prosperity were built on capital with origins far darker than acknowledged history records. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the Luxembourg protocols lies in their simplicity. They were not about ideology, revenge, or resurgence. They were about continuity, the quiet persistence of power. When the tanks were melted and the banners burned, the Reich endured not in armies, but in ledgers, signatures, and numbered accounts. The final surviving page of Protocol LX47, held under restricted custody in the Bundesarchiv, bears a single sentence typed in both German and English. In finance as in war, victory belongs to those who prepare their retreat. Beneath it are two signatures, one belonging to an American intelligence officer, the other to a man once listed as missing in action in 1945, SS Obersturmbannführer Kurt Dessel, former director of the Reichsbank's Foreign Reserves Division. How he survived, how he came to Luxembourg, and how his signature ended up beside that of an Allied representative remains unanswered. But his presence on that document is undeniable. What the world remembers as recovery and rebirth may have been, at its foundation, an exchange, a quiet bargain struck in a Luxembourg hotel room between enemies turned partners, sealed by mutual necessity and eternal secrecy. The war was said to have ended in 1945. Yet the evidence scattered through forgotten coastlines, redacted cables, and erased archives tells another story, one that never closed. Convoys vanished in the Baltic, scientists disappeared across oceans, and gold changed hands under new emblems. Each chapter, each operation leaves a residue of silence deeper than denial. Somewhere beneath the formal history lies the architecture of something older. Not a government or an army, but an idea that learned to survive through secrecy. Perhaps it is still alive, written in unmarked ledgers and unspoken agreements, waiting for the next war that needs no guns, only memory. What remains missing is not proof, but permission to see what has always been there, beneath the noise of victory, in the long shadow of the peace that followed.